Hey everyone, it's Carl. Today we're going to walk you through an install of one of our new Summit MAX-efi units on a 1968 Z28 Camaro. The MAX-efi unit is considered a self-tuning carburetor replacement. It's designed for the person running without boost or nitrous, and it uses 66 pound-per-hour injectors. The system is designed to support up to 500 horsepower, and it bolts directly to a square bore intake manifold, though adapters can be utilized for spread bore applications. It's also the same height as most carburetors. Throttle linkage is standard, so the original throttle cable and automatic transmission kickdown cables connect the same way. For those of you requiring Ford automatic transmission kickdown linkage, you'll need to use one of the commonly available cable conversion kits. Don't forget, if you're running an overdrive like a 700R4, you'll need to add a TV cable corrector as well. It has multiple vacuum ports for things such as the brake booster and distributor vacuum advance. Your current stock or street performance ignition system continues to function on its own with the original timing curve. One question you may ask is, will this system run E85 or ethanol fuels? The answer is yes, it will. The throttle body unit itself is equipped to run E85. However, E85 has a tendency to dry out and shrink the rubber elements of your fuel system over time, which then results in leaks and fuel component failures, especially in older vehicles. So if you plan to run E85, you should also upgrade your entire fuel system to E85 compatible parts. Also, as a general rule, 25 to 30% more E85 is required to make the same power as regular gasoline. As mentioned earlier, the Summit MAX-efi flows enough to support 500 horsepower on gasoline, which equates to roughly 350 horsepower on E85. Here's what you get in the box when you get your hands on the MAX-efi system: a 4-injector throttle body unit and base gasket, an ECU control unit, an O2 sensor installation kit, a coolant temp sensor and adapter, a simple wiring harness, a wired handheld control unit, a windshield clip to mount the handheld unit while driving, and a mini USB cable for connecting to your PC. This Camaro is a mostly stock car with a stout pump gas 383 small block Chevy transplant. It's currently running an old 780 CFM carburetor, but today we're going to upgrade it to our new MAX-efi 500 system. So let's get into it. The first thing you'll want to do is disconnect the battery negative terminal. You'll also want to drain about half of the antifreeze out of the radiator so you can install your coolant temp sensor. Like other EFI systems, our MAX-efi unit requires an oxygen sensor, so if you don't have one already, you'll need to install a provision for one. The single O2 sensor can be mounted on either exhaust bank, and the ideal location is about 2 to 4 inches after the exhaust collector. In any case, we also recommend it be at least 18 inches forward from the exhaust exit. The sensor itself should be mounted at least 10 degrees above horizontal, and you also don't want to mount your O2 sensor on the outside bend of an exhaust pipe. For our install, we drilled a 7/8 hole and welded our bung in place for a secure, leak-free connection. It's important that no air leaks exist anywhere in the exhaust system before or after the O2 sensor, as this will cause false readings. Quick note, whatever you do, don't start the engine without the sensor cable connected to the wiring harness and the EFI system fully operational, or you could damage the sensor. The next thing we did was remove the carburetor and replace it with our new MAX-efi throttle body. To remove the carburetor, we removed the fuel line, the throttle linkage, and vacuum lines. Then we removed the mounting nuts and lifted it off. This procedure is no different than changing out one carburetor for another. The throttle body has several vacuum ports on the front and back. There are 2 3/16" male nipples and 3 3/8" male nipples. If you have a drop base air cleaner, like we do, this would be a good time to test fit it on the throttle body unit for clearance. Depending on the design of your air cleaner base, you may need to use a small spacer to raise it up a bit. Our air cleaner base needed a bit of clearance, so we used a 3/4 inch spacer. At this point, you'll also want to be sure to check your hood clearance. We won't be using our stock mechanical fuel pump for this new system as it requires 58 psi of fuel pressure, so we removed it and installed a block-off plate. On this Camaro, we installed a new tanks replacement gas tank kit for 1967 and 68 Camaros and Firebirds. This kit includes an in-tank fuel pump and features a recessed area at the top, which helps make the installation and routing of hoses much easier. It also has a fuel level sender, internal sump, and baffling to prevent fuel starvation under heavy cornering. We chose to upgrade to the in-tank pump for both durability and better pump noise suppression. While the tank was out, we also mounted a Corvette C5 fuel filter assembly with a built-in fuel pressure regulator on the frame rail. This unit keeps the fuel flow steady at the required 58 psi. Since we were able to mount it so close to the fuel tank, we didn't need to run a long fuel return line from the engine bay. Now, the C5 filter regulator, in-tank pump, and new fuel tank are not necessary in order to run our new MAX-efi. You can still keep your stock tank and instead run a frame rail mounted electric fuel pump and filter regulator if you desire. Here's a diagram showing that setup. And here's a third option. If you still want to run your mechanical fuel pump and tank, you can. You'll need to purchase a G-Surge system and regulator or an Edelbrock EFI sump kit. These feed the throttle body the required 58 psi. A return line on the G-Surge or vent line on the Edelbrock is still required to run back to the tank. Once the tank was installed and the filter regulator mounted and plumbed, we ran the single new fuel injection rated supply line up along the frame rail and up into the engine compartment. Be sure to avoid sharp bends and metal edges. We also ran the red wire that powers the fuel pump right alongside it. We then installed an angled fuel fitting on our new throttle body and cut the excess fuel hose to a proper length. We then connected the fuel line to the throttle body unit. Next, we installed the MAX-efi wiring harness, which was surprisingly easy. We laid the main part of the harness on top of the engine and proceeded to hook everything up. The harness features weather-tight connectors that only fit specific corresponding connectors on the temp sensor, the O2 sensor, and the ECM, as well as the components on the throttle body unit, which include the T-map, the TPS, the fuel injectors, and IAC connections, so it's impossible to get them mixed up. Aside from the ground wire and the battery positive wire, which use ring terminals, there are 4 wires that use traditional spade connectors, and those are the ignition key power on, the fuel pump power, the tach signal, and the fan control. And be sure that when you plug in the 4 connectors for the fuel injectors, snap them in with the silver wire bar facing down. Once all the plugs were secure to the throttle body unit, we ran the ECU and power cable up inside the front fender from the firewall to the battery tray. We also connected the positive and negative ring terminals directly to the battery. We then mounted the ECU on the top of the front of the inner passenger side wheel well. We used double-sided tape here. You'll want to try and mount your ECU away from any excessive heat. After that, we installed the coolant temperature sensor in the manifold. We used a screw-in adapter with thread sealant and tightened it up. We then plugged the corresponding harness plug into it. The throttle linkage, vacuum booster, and distributor vacuum advance canister were all reconnected. You'll want to make sure that any unused vacuum ports are capped off. Aside from reinstalling the air cleaner, we're done. It's a clean installation. Most people would never know it's fuel injected unless we pointed it out. Time to put some gas in it, refill the coolant, and fire it up. We then took to the cockpit to do our initial setup using the MAX-efi handheld control unit. From the main menu of the control unit with the key on, we'll go into the initial setup and enter in some basic engine parameters including number of cylinders, displacement, cam range from mild to wild on a scale of 1 to 4, a rev limit, and an idle RPM. Now remember, during the first few times we cycle the key to prime the injectors, we will want to watch for fuel leaks. The first time you fire it up, keep the air filter off and the hood open so you have a good view of all fuel line connections and watch the ground for leaks. Keep in mind, proper ignition timing, initial, total, and vacuum advance is just as important to a fuel-injected vehicle as it is to a carbureted vehicle. Because our car was previously running a carburetor, our distributor and ignition timing wasn't disturbed. Our Camaro started right up and began idling for us as we wrapped up the initial setup. In addition to setting the idle speed on the handheld, you will also need to physically adjust the idle shut screw on the throttle body itself to set it properly. This procedure is laid out in detail in your instruction sheet. Keep in mind that it's normal for the idle to be a little rough and irregular at first, but as you drive it, the system quickly begins to make corrections as part of the self-tuning process. So that's it. Time to take this Camaro out for a spin. The new Summit Racing MAX-efi 500 throttle body fuel injection system is available now on summitracing.com. Head over there now and grab yours today.